Welcome to Tough Talk. Today my guest is Rick Ector. Rick is a gun rights activist. He is an NRA certified firearms instructor and runs Legally Armed in Detroit. In 2016, he was the winner of the Second Amendment Foundation Defender of Liberty Award. Welcome, Rick.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Well, thank you for coming back on. So last time you were on the show, we talked about Dr. Ossian Sweet case.
Yes, we did.
And I have to tell you that on another show, I had the superintendent of Bloomfield Hills School here, and he was not aware of the case, so I briefly told him about the case. I urged him to start incorporating it into the school curriculum.
Oh, awesome.
I mean, I think it should be taught, metro-wide in all the schools. It's such an important case.
It is.
But today, we can talk about another interesting case that took place in Detroit, and that's about General Laney. Why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, General Laney was a person who resided in Detroit back in the 90s. He was an entrepreneur. Back in that era, in the 90s, there was a few gun shops in the region, in the Metro Detroit area. Over time, they started closing for whatever reason. And the politics in Detroit started to impact the gun range business, that space in the business environment. And one of the laws that changed was that there was going to be a moratorium on new gun ranges that were going to be allowed to operate in the city of Detroit. So when we go back to 1993, when this gun range existed in Detroit under previous management, it wasn't operated as a business that was open to the public. It was more like, it was operated like a private club. And in this private club, people in the community, particularly black people and otherwise in the community who actually lived in that neighborhood, were not allowed to patronize that business and to shoot guns and buy guns that were offered for sale. So back in 1993, General Laney purchased this shop in the city of Detroit over on Shane Street, and it was a great boon to the local community. Detroit for some time has always been challenged with respect to guns, with respect to crime in the region, and Mr. Laney provided affordable solutions for people who wanted to take on a more active role in their personal protection. So from 1993 to 1999, General Laney was operating his shop peacefully without incident in the city until 1999. In 1999, the local government, the sheriff, he came in and he brought a couple of Confederates into his shop with the sole purpose of putting General Laney out of business. He was trying to levy a straw purchase charge against General Laney. Essentially what a straw purchase is when an individual purchases a firearm legally, but for the purpose of transferring the ownership to someone who cannot legally own a gun. So let's say there's a felon and he wants a gun. So what the felon does, he puts a legitimate person who could pass a background check in position to buy the gun so that when he buys it, he can later transfer it illegally to the person who's ineligible to own a gun. So this 18-year-old Confederate came into General Laney's shop, tried to buy the gun. When General Laney looked at his documentation and his ID, saw that he wasn't eligible to own a gun, to buy a gun, and he properly refused him. Undaunted, our members of the government, they decided that they would not leave without manufacturing a case against General Laney. So they had one of the stooges, one of the Confederates, purchase the gun legally with proper documentation, passing a background check. They then took the gun outside in the parking lot and then sold the gun out in the parking lot to their Confederate, the 18-year-old, And then they used this transaction as the basis of a prosecution against General Laney. The first court case, it was decided in General Laney's favor that nothing illegal had happened, that in fact he properly transferred the firearm. However, the government, and for whatever reason, they were undaunted in their pursuit of criminal charges against General Laney. This gun shop had to be shut down by any means necessary. So they appealed to the appellate court, and the appellate court voted 2-1 that a law had been broken. So General Laney was then forced to raise $50,000. Of course, he didn't have that kind of money operating a gun shop on Shane Street. But there were sympathetic gun rights advocates all over the country who helped General Laney raise $50,000 to successfully defend himself. And at the end of the day, justice prevailed, and the Michigan Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and General Laney was allowed to clear his name. So very important case here in the state of Michigan, and I want to make sure that people still remember General Laney and his legacy here in the city of Detroit.
So what happened to his gun range?
Well, shortly, I wouldn't say immediately thereafter, there were a few years later, after this famous court case here in the city of Detroit, that General Laney took ill and he was required to be hospitalized for a time. During his hospitalization, his gun shop was burned down to the ground under mysterious circumstances. People who are familiar with that neighborhood knew that General Laney's shop and only one other structure existed on that whole entire block. So someone had an interest, for whatever reason, to burn down that shop. And presumably, you know, my personal opinion, I believe they were hired or they actually worked for the government.
And was that the last gun range in Detroit?
That was the last gun range in the city of Detroit. We currently do not have a gun range in Detroit. The city of Detroit has an ordinance on its books that permission has to be granted. And of course, anyone who tries to acquire that permission, I'm sure, will be denied. In my opinion, what it's going to take is going to take an individual who wants to invest in the city of Detroit and to open a gun range and to, if necessary, to file a lawsuit similar to what gun rights advocates in the city of Chicago have done recently. And I'm quite certain that if someone was to do that here, they would prevail and, if necessary, force the city of Detroit to pay a stiff financial penalty.
What, you mentioned in Chicago, do they not allow gun ranges in Chicago at this time?
There used to be an ordinance. That ordinance was struck down as unconstitutional. There is not currently a gun range in the city of Chicago, but let's knock on wood and hope that that happens soon. If there's any city in this country that should have a gun range within its geographical borders, it is the city of Chicago. City of Chicago is known for its high number of homicides that occur in that city, and of course just about every other violent crime that you can enumerate happens there. There is a need for good people who can pass background checks and otherwise comply with the law to be able to buy a firearm in their local community. And it's a travesty that they haven't been able to do so, and by extension, it's a travesty that we cannot legally, locally buy a gun here in the city of Detroit.
You can't buy a gun in Detroit?
Not from a gun shop.
Oh, right.
Now, you can buy one in a private sale, a private purchase from another individual, assuming that everyone complies with the law and everyone does everything that they're required to do. But there are no places in the city of Detroit that operate as a business, that is a gun shop, where you can buy a gun in the city of Detroit, and that is unconscionable.
It is. It's boggles the mind, really. I was not aware of that.
Well, if anyone pays attention to the nightly telecast, there are quite a few violent crimes that happen here. We're a city, I believe the census puts it somewhere between 650, 700,000 people. There's a need for good people to have access to affordable guns in their neighborhood to be able to protect their homes and to protect their families. It is just insane that we do not have a gun range in the city of Detroit.
Okay. Recently, we had a tragic school shooting in Parkland, Florida. Everyone has a solution to prevent this from happening again. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this.
You know, yes, I concur. It was truly a tragic state of affairs. Usually when you do what we call a post-mortem on shootings of this type, invariably what you find out is that there were clues, there were situations that transpired that gave people who were close to the situation, that is, to the shooter, that knew that there was a problem. This guy was a known problem, a known issue in his community, a known problem that people had concerns with, and there were actually complaints that were levied with local law enforcement that this person is an issue. And you know what? Like in all these cases and stories, no one did anything, you know, and the travesty is when after the bad thing occurs and everyone does their investigation, there were numerous opportunities for this individual to be dealt with, to have the legal process actually work, and to provide a means to save lives. And even when we look at some of the things that did not occur, it further compounds the story while the tragedy took place. You know, there were law enforcement who were actually on the scene, and for whatever reason, they violated typical protocols that have been established since Columbine. You know, there was 3 or 4 police officers that were, I guess, were just hanging out outside securing the perimeter. Ever since Columbine, all across the country, the standard protocol is to go in right away and to try to mitigate and stop the bad guy. Apparently that was not done. It wasn't until sometime later when other forces from the government went in, and by that time 17 people had already lost their lives. So there were opportunities to resolve this issue by people who were close to the shooter, who knew he had problems, who for whatever reason chose to look the other way until something bad happened. And then when something bad happened, I believe local law enforcement handled it badly. For whatever reason, they did not go in and stop this guy sooner. I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been any loss of life, but hey, if we can do better than 17, we should certainly avail ourselves of that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Now, some people are saying we should have, you know, armed guards at all the schools. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think as a society, we determine how important things are by our willingness to assign armed guards. We have armed guards at our banks. We have armed personnel at various federal facilities. Why in the world would we not do more than just pay lip service at our nation's schools? Things that we could do that would not require much is that for individuals who work at that school, whether they're actually in the education process or they're in some official support capacity, if they are willing to do so voluntarily and they're willing to get the training and they're willing to supply a gun, there's no reason why those school districts should not allow those individuals to lawfully carry a gun, assuming that they have the appropriate license from the state or whatever local entity that is in play. There's no reason why we should not allow staff at that school to actually be there and to be armed. And some of the reasons why I'm hearing people against the plan, they seem to think that owning and carrying a firearm is something that can only be done by law enforcement. It can be done by any citizen who gets the appropriate training and whatever licenses that are required by their local jurisdiction. It's something that requires a PhD. I'm not demeaning, firearms education, but it's not very difficult, and the laws are fairly easy to understand, to grasp, and to apply. My point is that if someone was there to either engage that perpetrator initially or as soon as possible, we probably would not have had any loss of life, and if we did, we would not have approached the number that we finally ended up with 17. Teachers can do it, administrators can do it, support staff such as janitors can do it. It's unconscionable that we guard everything else and we don't guard our children, particularly when history tells us that bad people willing to do bad things, they intentionally seek out gun-free zones because they know that they will not be stopped before they can accomplish their evil goals of killing innocent people. And the other thing that we can do is we can get rid of gun-free zones, make these areas more hazardous to people who want to do bad things to good people.
Okay. Now, it's interesting you said, evil people. I've heard people say that, call this shooter an idiot. I don't think it's being an idiot. I think it truly is an evil person.
I wouldn't put him up as an idiot either. To actually accomplish the planning that he needed to do, it was only, in my opinion, just looking at the accounts in the aftermath. It just happened that one of the members of law enforcement was alert and had recalled some information that he had received previously that gave him the hint that the perpetrator, once he saw him, identified him quickly and readily. He could have very easily had slipped through the cracks, and we could not have determined, at least at that point, who the bad guy was and certainly bring him into custody. Now, this case in terms of mass shootings, mass killings is rather unique in the sense that the bad guy in this story did not take his own life, which is what typically happens, but he was particularly evil in my mind. He wanted to actually get away, slip through the cracks, and then observe the actual aftermath to, I guess, engage in some perverse joy of watching the disarray and the aftermath of the incident. But yeah, we definitely need to do more than just pay lip service to the protection of our children at schools.
Okay.
We need to look at churches too. Of course, a lot of pastors are doing a lot more with churches due to the fact that we've had some mass killings at churches all over the country too, and a lot of pastors are using a lot of different strategies to arm their homes and houses of worship. We need to be more serious about protecting our children at school and people in general at places where a large number of people congregate.
I think it goes to show that we all have to take personal responsibility for our safety and our loved ones, really.
I'm glad you brought that up for the simple fact that this question as to who is responsible for your safety has come up before. It has actually come up before the Supreme Court on at least 3 different occasions with 3 different cases. And the resolution, the outcome that the United States Supreme Court has come up with is that safety is your individual responsibility. It is not the job of the government at any level, whether it's federal, state, county, or local, to ensure that you are not a victim of a violent crime such as a murder or a rape. The Supreme Court has ruled that that is your individual responsibility. So if something bad happens, people die, or in the story we just talked about a few moments ago where law enforcement, instead of honoring their public duty to go in and to approach the would-be mass killer, they were outside in safety and they refused to put themselves in harm's way. It is, unfortunately, the responsibility of those children and their parents to keep them from being victims of crime. And you know, those parents need to do more locally to get the laws changed so that someone is assuming responsibility for their children while they're at school and vulnerable.
Okay. I was going to ask you what the purpose of an assault rifle is, but first, I think maybe a better question is there such a thing as an assault rifle?
You know, I really don't know what in the world an assault rifle is. That's some type of term that means something to them, and I guess it strikes fear and terror in the minds of the people that hear it. When I hear people characterize the shooter at this recent mass killing as having a assault rifle, you know, the rifle that was used is a typical rifle. It is a typical firearm in the way in which it is fired. One trigger pull creates one discharge, which creates one bullet to come out one at a time. Per trigger pull, one bullet exits the gun. So there's no pull, hold, and depress the trigger and multiple rounds come out successively. That is an act of fiction. It is information that even the anti-gun people are aware of, but they are quite willing to continue to perpetuate this falsehood because they believe it holds some political value to them. A gun, because it's long, black, and hard, that does not make it scary. It has a variety of features that to the uneducated that look like it makes it more deadly. It does not. One trigger pull, one discharge. Functionally, it's no different than a handgun.
Now, what about having a bump stock on the rifle?
Well, I mean, a bump stock is a unique novelty. You know, the thing that I found particularly interesting is the previous president, you know, he had an opportunity to review bump stocks, and the determination that they made was that it was more of a novelty type gadget, particularly for individuals who want to shoot a lot of ammunition in a very quick period of time. A lot of people I talk to, you know, very close to the gun community, I can't find many people who would willingly shoot all that ammunition, with ammunition being so dear and expensive. But you know what? If there's a person out there who wants to engage in some good, wholesome recreation and shoot and expend a lot of ammunition in a quick period of time, hey, have at it, have a good time. You know, it's just like anything else, whether we're talking about knives, whether we're talking about hands, whether we're talking about pistols, rifles, automobiles, gasoline, water, and rope. There's always an individual out there, for whatever sick, perverse reason, who will take an item that is otherwise legal and will use it for their evil purposes and harm another person. Me, myself, personally, I don't have a problem with bump stocks being legal. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. The issue is that people are thinking, okay, if someone can do something bad with it, well, we need to ban it. Well, we need to ban everything, including our very own hands. Using that logic, we should all voluntarily allow someone to take an axe and chop off our hands. A lot of people are hurt and killed with just hands. It's not the tool, it is the individual, it is the mind and the heart of the bad guys that do these bad, atrocious, most awful, terrible things.
What are your thoughts when you hear someone say we need common sense gun laws?
Well, the first thing that comes immediately to mind is that most people are probably unaware of how many gun laws we currently have on the books. There are over 20,000 gun laws that are on the books, and they are all not necessarily the most logical in sum total when you take them all together. And then they're not the same in one state versus another. The thing about people who are so intent on banning guns or the possession of guns or the operation of guns, they probably have no clue as to how tightly regulated firearm ownership currently is, firearm operation currently is. If you use a firearm improperly, in my opinion, I believe you will be judged more harshly for a gun crime than you will any other crime. Not that I have a problem with that, because I believe that most citizens can be entrusted to safely and responsibly own a firearm, and you most assuredly shouldn't just go indiscriminately killing and harming and hurting your fellow man. So, you know what? The thing about gun banners, there are people that just hate guns for whatever reason, and that's fine. You can feel that way. And as a person who believes in the Constitution, I support the First Amendment too. I support your right to speak out against guns. You should not be attacking my Second Amendment right, and you shouldn't be watering it down and diluting it. If your ultimate goal is to get rid of guns or the right to own a gun, there is a process. That process is called changing the Constitution. If you can get 2/3 of the states to go along with you, then you know what? We follow the rules. I will reluctantly go along with it, but I will not just stand pat and just watch people continually dilute our right to own a firearm. And let's be real. Let's acknowledge why the framers gave us the Second Amendment. The framers did not give us the Second Amendment so that we could go hunt. They didn't even give it to us for personal protection and self-defense. They knew that liberty over time was something with new laws being generated over time, that gun rights and gun ownership would come under attack. The Second Amendment is a safeguard. It is a tool such that the people, if they needed to overthrow a government that has turned tyrannical and wanted to ban guns without following the process of changing the Constitution, it allows the people to overthrow the government.
Okay. Now you mentioned over 20,000 gun laws. I want to read you a quote, and maybe you know who said this. We'll test your knowledge.
I'm on the spot now.
Consider the fact that we now have on the law books of this nation over 20,000 laws governing the sale, distribution, and use of firearms. Do you know who said that?
I'm embarrassed, man. Who said that? Was that me?
No. Congressman John Dingell, a Democrat, said this in 1965.
Well, he was right then, and he's right today.
Yep. So, unfortunately, we're out of time.
Man, where does the time go, man? I had a ball, and you know what? This is my second time on your show.
I'll have you
Glad
back
to be
again.
here. If you need me, just call me, and I will come.
Okay. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you for having me, man.